Glyphs were added to the game in Wrath of the Lich King as a way to further customize your character and increase its power or utility, and nowadays, they are used almost exclusively for cosmetic effects. When first announced, Blizzard said there would be 3 kinds of glyphs: major, lesser, and minor. They also created the profession of inscription in order to create these glyphs, because for some of you who may not know, inscription was not one of the original professions in the game, and was in fact the last major profession Blizzard created for Wrath of the Lich King. When Wrath of the Lich King launched, they eventually removed the lesser glyphs and only had the 2 types of major and minor. Major glyphs were large improvements to your character's abilities, where they could increase the power of major spells or give them extra effects, like adding a dot to a spell, or giving an effect a stun on top of whatever else it did. Now, minor glyphs were just cosmetic changes or quality of life changes to certain abilities. There were definitely some useful minor glyphs, like how hunters had minor glyphs that made ticks of their men pet give your pet happiness, and another minor glyph that reduced the cooldown of Fey Death, both of which were actually incredibly useful things to have. But on a whole, minor glyphs were just kind of minor changes that rarely affected combat. And in order to use glyphs, you needed to have the glyphs in your inventory, and you had to be next to a lexicon of power, which was located near scribe trainers. And using the glyphs would consume the glyph in your inventory, and if you wanted to change the glyph to something else, you had to buy another glyph and replace it. Then if you wanted to change it back, you had to buy that glyph again in order to replace it. Glyphs were basically a consumable thing that you had to buy constantly if you wanted to change them out. So most people would just find whichever glyphs were the best and just kind of use those ones for the most part. And glyphs also worked as level up incentives. As you leveled up, you got to unlock more of your glyph slots. At level 15, you got your first major and minor glyphs. At level 30, you got an extra major, and so on and so on. The glyph unlocks kind of worked like how our talent point system works today. And then this was how glyphs worked for the first expansion they were introduced. Consumable items that you could use to increase the power of your character. But Blizzard didn't really like how people had to carry around glyphs in their bags if they wanted to change specs, or alternate to PvP. So, in Cataclysm, they turned the glyphs into permanent recipe-type things that once you learned it, you could just choose it again later on without having to buy another glyph. And I remember when this change went through, because in the Goldmaker community, this change was known as Glyphmas, because everyone was trying to buy out all the glyphs they possibly could, so they could just learn them all immediately and not ever have to buy glyphs again. This change severely limited how scribes could make money, since glyphs were no longer consumables that needed to be bought all the time. So this is when Blizzard started giving scribes more things to focus on besides just glyphs. Also in Cataclysm, glyphs saw a few more changes. Blizzard had announced a new system called Path of the Titans, which ironically were supposed to kind of work like how Azerite traits work today, but they eventually canceled it and instead incorporated some of the ideas into the glyph system. And with this, they added a new glyph slot called Prime Glyphs. Prime Glyphs were basically what major glyphs used to be, where they were just direct improvements to your character's power in some way, shape, or form. Major glyphs were changed to be also improvement to your character's power, but with some kind of trade-off, like Immolation Trap doing 100% more damage but having half the duration. And minor glyphs were still basically the same, just cosmetic changes. And since glyphs were permanent now, they added their first ever system of using a consumable item to change them out. And these items were called Vanishing Powder and Dust of Disappearance. This system is still kind of how we change our talent points to this day. It's just currently we use an item that then gives us 1 minute to change our talent points around. But this was like the first ever iteration of that mechanic. And with this new glyph system, they changed the level of rewards for obtaining glyphs. It used to be you unlock the glyph slots every 15 levels or so. In the new system, it was every 25 levels. So for level 25, you got 1 prime, 1 major, and 1 minor glyph slot. And then at level 50, you unlock the second row of those. And then level 75, you got the third row. It was also in this time period where players still had talent points. So it was still kind of fun to level up and get these kinds of rewards. In Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard said they didn't really like how prime glyphs turned out, and just removed them. So in Mists of Pandaria, you only had major and minor glyphs, and they still kind of worked like how they used to, in that major glyphs would give you power, but usually at some kind of cost, like how Dispriest could cast Penance while moving, but it increased the mana cost of that spell. And the level up rewards for Glyphs were still the same as they were in Cataclysm, except you just didn't get the Prime Glyph slot anymore. Then in Warlords of Draenor, Glyphs were still basically the same, except they gave you the ability to learn certain Glyphs as you leveled up. Not all of them, mind you, just some of them, as kind of level up rewards. Blizzard also had been on the trend of heavily nerfing Glyphs so they weren't as impactful to gameplay as they used to be. And in WoD, major Glyphs were at their weakest, with some classes not even having 3 major Glyphs that would give them direct damage or healing buffs. Then in Legion, after making Glyphs less and less important with every new expansion, they just straight up removed the Glyph interface, removed major Glyphs from the game, and now only minor Glyphs are available. But now, since there is no more Glyph interface, you can technically have as many minor Glyphs as you want. And nearly all of them are just cosmetic changes, like changing what kind of water elemental your Frost Mage uses. And in BfA, there wasn't really any changes to the Glyphs. They still work like they did in Legion. In fact, I had to look up to see if Glyphs were still in the game while I was making this video, because I couldn't remember the last time I bought or used one. So Glyphs, over their history, went from an integral part of your class that directly impacted the power of your character and gave you more level up rewards, to a feature that today, many people probably have forgotten exists. Technically, cosmetic Glyphs have been in the game since they were added, so Glyphs in some way, shape, or form still exists, and would be more apt to say Glyphs that directly increase the power of your character have been removed from the game entirely, with Blizzard's attempts to remove as many barriers to entry for raids as possible. Because if there's less ways to customize your characters, then there's less things to worry about that you have to do before you can jump into a raid.